This is the greatest financial experiment in human history, and most people don't even realize they're living inside of it. Global debt, public, private, household, corporate, has exploded to levels no civilization has ever carried before. Today, governments borrow trillions as if it were nothing. Central banks print money with keystrokes. Families take out 30-year mortgages as casually as buying groceries. And yet, we still talk as if debt were something normal, harmless, and permanent. The truth is more unsettling. Debt has always been a tool of power, a weapon of control, and a ticking time bomb waiting for the right spark. The real question is not if the current mountain of global debt will cause a crisis, but when and who will pay the price when the system resets. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to the roots of debt itself. Debt is as old as civilization. The first clay tablets in Mesopotamia, thousands of years before Christ, were not poetry or philosophy, but ledgers, records of who owed whom, how much grain, how many cattle. In early societies, debt was not just an economic tool, it was sacred. Priests and kings oversaw debts, enforced them, and sometimes forgave them in sweeping jubilees when obligations were erased to keep the social order from collapsing. Imagine that for a moment. The very idea that the survival of society required hitting a reset button on the financial system. Debt was power, but too much debt was a danger. Ancient rulers understood what modern leaders pretend to forget, that you could not enslave an entire population with obligations forever. At some point, the system cracks. Fast forward to the Renaissance and the rise of banking families like the Medici in Florence. Debt had evolved from grain and cattle to gold and credit. Kings and popes borrowed enormous sums to wage wars, build cathedrals, and fund empires. But debt always carried risk. Spain, flush with silver from the New World, declared bankruptcy 4 times in the 16th century because the crown borrowed beyond its means. That is the first lesson. Even empires stuffed with gold can drown in debt when ambition outpaces reality. Debt was no longer just personal, it was geopolitical. It fueled wars, toppled dynasties, and redrew maps. The modern debt explosion, however, began in the 20th century. After the First World War, nations carried debts so enormous that repayment seemed impossible. Germany was saddled with reparations under the Treaty of Versailles, obligations so crushing that economists at the time warned they would destabilize the country. They were right. The hyperinflation of the early 1920s, when Germans carried wheelbarrows of paper marks to buy bread, was a direct consequence of debt obligations that could not be met in real terms. That disaster left scars deep enough to shape the politics that led to the Second World War. Debt was not just an accounting problem, it was the fuel of chaos. Then came 1944 and the Bretton Woods Conference. This was the moment the financial system of the modern world was engineered. The United States, holding 2/3 of the world's gold at the end of the war, set the rules. The dollar became the anchor, convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. Other currencies pegged themselves to the dollar. The idea was stability. The reality was dependence. Every nation's debt, every government bond, every economic calculation now rested on the promise that the United States would maintain discipline. For a while, it worked, but the temptation to borrow, to spend beyond one's means, never goes away. By the 1960s, with the cost of the Vietnam War and domestic programs piling up, the United States printed more dollars than it had gold. Foreign governments noticed. They started demanding gold in exchange for paper. In 1971, Richard Nixon slammed the door, ending the dollar's link to gold. Debt was now untethered. Governments could borrow and print at will, limited only by trust. That moment in 1971 was the quiet revolution. It transformed debt from something finite into something infinite. With gold gone, central banks discovered they could manipulate interest rates to control the economy. When growth slowed, lower rates encouraged borrowing. And when crises hit, more debt was created to patch the hole. Each rescue required more leverage than the last. The 1980s saw massive expansions of public debt under leaders like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, justified as necessary for defense or economic reform. Developing countries borrowed heavily from Western banks, triggering the Latin American debt crisis when they could not repay. The pattern was set. Use debt to chase prosperity, then drown when the tide recedes. The 2008 financial crisis was not, as many believe, simply about housing. It was about debt layered upon debt, a pyramid of leverage so vast that when a single corner crumbled, the whole structure shook. Mortgages were packaged into securities, sold to investors, insured with derivatives, and amplified by leverage ratios of 30 to 1. The collapse destroyed banks, wiped out pensions, and forced governments to intervene with trillions in bailouts. Here was the bitter irony. Those who borrowed recklessly were rescued, while ordinary citizens were left with unemployment, foreclosures, and austerity. Debt was revealed not as a neutral instrument, but as a system rigged to protect the powerful. Since then, the numbers have gone from alarming to surreal. Global debt has tripled in the last 2 decades, reaching more than $300 trillion by 2023. To put that into perspective, that is nearly 4 times the size of the global economy. Governments, corporations, households, all have piled on. Some nations, like Japan, now carry public debt levels over 200% of GDP. The United States adds trillions every year with barely a debate. Emerging economies borrow in foreign currencies, exposing themselves to sudden collapse when interest rates rise. The whole system has become a giant balancing act where stability depends on the illusion that debt can expand forever without consequence. But debt always has consequences. It distorts behavior, it creates bubbles, it shifts wealth, and most importantly, it enslaves future generations. Every dollar borrowed today is a claim on tomorrow's work. And when the numbers grow too large, the repayment becomes impossible. That is why history is filled with defaults, restructurings, inflations, and crises. Debt always ends one of 3 ways. You pay it back honestly, you inflate it away, or you default. No empire, no system has ever escaped that truth. The present-day consequences are everywhere, but most people don't see them because debt has become invisible. Think about it. When your government runs a deficit, it doesn't knock on your door and ask for cash. It issues bonds, sells them to banks or foreign investors, and quietly builds a tab in your name. When you swipe a credit card, you're not paying, you're borrowing. When corporations announce record profits, often those profits are juiced by borrowed money used to buy back stock. The system thrives on leverage. But leverage works like gravity. It feels weightless on the way up and crushing on the way down. The entire financial system today is floating on promises, promises that may not be kept. Take the United States, the anchor of the global system. Its national debt passed $34 trillion in 2024. That number is so huge, it has become abstract. But translated into reality, every taxpayer is carrying hundreds of thousands of dollars in obligations. Interest payments alone now rival defense spending. That means the world's largest superpower is borrowing money just to pay the interest on the money it already borrowed. This is not unique. Across Europe, debt to GDP ratios remain well above 100% in countries like Italy and Greece. In China, the debt explosion has been hidden in local governments and state-owned enterprises, creating shadow liabilities that may be far larger than official figures suggest. Everywhere you look, debt has metastasized. The trap is psychological as much as financial. Politicians love debt because it buys time. Raising taxes angers voters. Cutting spending angers even more. Borrowing, however, seems painless. Future generations will deal with it. The illusion works until it doesn't. When interest rates rise, the burden suddenly becomes visible. This is exactly what we've seen since 2022, when central banks raised rates to fight inflation. Suddenly, the cost of servicing debt surged. Governments faced tighter budgets. Households faced higher mortgage payments. Corporations saw their refinancing costs explode. Debt is like a sleeping predator, harmless while it rests, deadly when it awakens. And yet, even as the risks grow, debt continues to be sold as a path to prosperity. Students are told to take on tens of thousands in loans for degrees that may or may not pay off. Families are told to stretch for homes they can barely afford because real estate always goes up. Nations are told that deficits don't matter because central banks can print unlimited currency. This is the great lie of modern finance, that debt is free, infinite, and safe. History screams the opposite. What comes next is not hard to guess if you've studied economic history. There are only a few escape routes when debt piles up beyond reason. One is inflation, silently reducing the value of what's owed by debasing the currency. This is already happening. When prices rise 10%, your savings lose 10% of their power. But your government's debt shrinks by the same measure. It is a hidden tax, and it is politically easier than default. The second route is restructuring, admitting the debt cannot be paid and renegotiating terms. We saw this with Greece during the Eurozone crisis, when bondholders were forced to accept losses. The third route is outright default, refusing to pay at all. History is littered with sovereign defaults, from Argentina to Russia, each time sparking turmoil. None of these options is painless. They are all forms of breaking a promise. So, which way are we headed? The signs point toward inflation as the preferred path. Central banks may posture about fighting it, but debt-laden governments need it. They need the erosion of real value to make their obligations bearable. That means ordinary citizens, you, will carry the cost. Your savings, your wages, your future purchasing power will be drained to preserve the system. It is the oldest trick in the book, and yet people fall for it again and again. Because inflation creeps, because the numbers are abstract, because the system trains us to believe that debt is someone else's problem. But here's the final insight. Debt is not just economics. It is about power. Who lends? Who borrows? Who gets rescued when things collapse? The financial system is designed so that when debt becomes unbearable, the powerful rarely pay. Banks are bailed out. Corporations restructure. Politicians retire. Ordinary people, meanwhile, lose homes, jobs, and hope. That is why understanding debt is not just financial education. It is survival. If you don't see the trap, you will live inside it without even realizing you're chained. So what should we do? First, strip away the illusions. Understand that debt is not neutral. Every dollar borrowed has consequences. Second, recognize the historical pattern. No empire, no nation, no system has escaped a reckoning with debt. The timelines vary, but the destination is always the same. Third, protect yourself. That doesn't mean panic or burying gold in the backyard. It means building real wealth that isn't entirely at the mercy of paper promises, assets that hold value across cycles, knowledge that cuts through the lies, perspective that keeps you from falling for the same old tricks, because the system will keep repeating them. This is the lesson of history. Debt builds, leaders deny, crises erupt, and societies reset. The only choice you have is whether you face that cycle blind or awake. If you understand the traps, you can avoid becoming their victim. If you don't, you will pay for mistakes you never made. Global debt is not just a number on a spreadsheet. It is the shadow that looms over our future, and unless we learn, it will crush us the same way it has crushed every empire before. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.